Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Learn to Love podcast, your guide to everything love, sex, intimacy, and relationships. Each week, your host, Zach Beach, interviews new experts on love, including couples therapists, relationship coaches, sex educators, and best-selling authors. Learn the best tips and cutting-edge wisdom to better love yourself, others, and the world. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, beautiful souls. I'm so positively delighted that you could join us on the Learn to Love podcast. I am your host, Zach Beach, and I'm excited to introduce our guest for today's episode, Dr. Bruce Chalmer. Dr. Bruce Chalmer is a psychologist in Vermont who has been working with couples for over 30 years. Through his teaching, consulting, writing, podcast, and videos about relationships, his ideas have helped thousands of couples and their therapists. He is the author of It's Not About Communication, Reigniting the Spark, and How to Get It Back. He was on the show earlier in episode 112 on the 7 words to jumpstart your love life. And he came back onto the show to talk about his newest book, Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again. I don't think we've yet had an episode on betrayal, so it was such an enlightening conversation to have him back on, and I hope you will find it of use in your relationships. So without further ado, let's begin. Hello, Bruce. Welcome back to the show.
Well, hi, Zach. It's great to be back. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, how you doing?
I am doing well. I've been having a nice summer here in Vermont. I hope things are going well for you too.
Yes, it's been a lovely summer. It's a beautiful day, and it's so wonderful to have you back on to get into a very juicy and meaty topic based on your new book, Betrayal and Forgiveness. And you have a really good definition of betrayal that I found in your book. So what does betrayal mean to you?
Yeah, betrayal, we all get hurt. I mean, that's the human condition. We get hurt by various things. And betrayal is more than just when you're hurt. Betrayal is when you're hurt by someone with whom you have a relationship that you would never have thought they would hurt you that way. So it's really based on your relationship and your expectations of that relationship. That's what constitutes betrayal. A stranger can hurt you, but they can't betray you. You don't have any expectations of them. But someone who's a member of your inner circle, a spouse or a significant other or a family member or, a member of your community, a member of your tribe, a member of your team, whatever. Those are the folks who can betray you because you have certain expectations of loyalty from them. When those expectations get violated in a serious way, that's what betrayal is.
I love that. When we are hurt by someone who you never thought would hurt you in some way.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
I'm just reflecting back.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. And so I wrote about a betrayal. Why would I write a book about that? Well, I'm a couples therapist. I see couples all the time. And I don't know, I didn't do a careful count, but I'm guessing well over half of the folks who see me in a first session are dealing with something that they consider betrayal. And so it seemed like a really relevant topic to write about because I work with folks about it all the time. And I've learned a lot from the people I've worked with, which, most of us who do this work, I think most of what we learn from the folks we work with. And so I have been privileged to learn from lots and lots of couples over the years and, various people over the years about how they manage to handle betrayal, how they are able to recover from it often. And I find that very inspiring.
I love that. So it's interesting that this definition is based on our expectations. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the role expectations can play in our life and relationships, because you might have heard that phrase, if you live in a world of expectations, you're going to live in a world of disappointments. A lot of spiritual communities kind of like poo-poo the idea of like expectations, or because it like takes you out of the present moment and into the future. But on the other hand, I think it's perfectly reasonable in relationships to expect our partner to do what they said they were going to do or to be on their good behavior. So what are your thoughts on expectations?
Yeah. What can I say? I'm a fan. I get like, I like to speak up for the underdog there. I understand the concept that says, yes, if you go around with these really exacting expectations, you're going to get disappointed a lot. Of course. So indeed, many, as you point out, many different spiritual traditions and many different psychological approaches will say, hey, adjust your expectations, But I don't go as far as to say, oh, it's all about completely losing all expectations. It's why I would say even though I love reading about Buddhism, and I know you just wrote a wonderful book, by the way, about it, which I'm happy to put in a plug to your listeners for. It's not out yet. I saw a pre-publication copy, and I'm a
Appreciate
fan,
that. Thank you.
But I'm not a Buddhist, because I think and I'm sure this is unfair to Buddhism, but what the heck, where I depart from my probable misunderstanding of Buddhism is where that sense is you just sort of lose all expectations. Something about my being Jewish, I think of this as a particularly Jewish attitude I'm about to express, although I'm sure it's not exclusively so. But there's something about the notion that there is a particularist sense as well as a universalist sense to love. That we need to love the people closest to us in a different way from the people who are farther from us, even though we should love everybody. And that's the difference. That's what those expectations are all about. I expect of my wife, and I hope and think she expects of me some, for want of a better word, restrictions on our behavior that I wouldn't expect of any other relationship. That's part of what defines that relationship. And I value that. I don't think that means that I'm making myself incredibly vulnerable by loving her the way I do. But I think that's a good idea, not a bad idea. I think the idea of, I can love everyone, but, and again, probably an unfair characterization, but when I think about the Gandhis and the Mother Teresas and the amazing saints of the world, I also tend to think that they had difficulty with individual and family relationships often because they loved everybody. And it's wonderful to love everybody, but we should have an in-group and an out-group and be nice to the out-group, but we should still have an in-group, which again, I think is a very Jewish attitude. That's sort of our brand, No, we're going to be separate, but we're not going to say you're wrong. We're going to be separate. Work with it.
I see.
Drives people crazy.
Well, I feel like in partnership, we also bring out the best in people. And often that's a result of sort of like setting a high bar. Like, I know you're a loving, kind, and understanding individual, and I'm going to expect that from you. And because my partner expects me to be the best, I end up kind of being the best for them. So there's also that piece to it.
There is. I will note, of course, in that same context, that the one thing I know I'm going to do occasionally is fail to meet that expectation. Because I'm going to have an off day. I'm going to not be playing my A game. I'm going to be grumpy or something. And then I hope if I have a decent sense of guilt, I will regret that. But that's what introduces the need for forgiveness in any kind of relationship. Every spiritual tradition that I know of has some kind of technology of forgiveness, some way of achieving that sense that it's possible to fail in the expectation someone has of you and be forgiven. And that's the other side. Of course, forgiveness is a step along the way of healing from a betrayal.
I love that. So I think when people hear the word betrayal, probably the first thing that comes up is sexual affairs and dishonesty. But what are some other forms of betrayal that happen in relationship?
Yeah, and I have a number of examples in my book, and several of them are indeed about sexual infidelity, because that does tend to be the number one, among them all in my practice. But yeah, there are other ones. I have an example of someone who was disinherited and didn't find out. He was disinherited by her father and didn't find out until he suddenly died. And the will was read, and she discovered she'd been disinherited, had obviously nowhere to process it with her father who had died, and felt incredibly hurt, incredibly betrayed. I have an example of two women who were close friends all the way from college and business partners, and one of them blew it badly and they were in business together, and she didn't file tax returns for years, and the IRS came along and put a lien on both their houses, completely surprised the other one, and because she'd never been told, and she felt very betrayed by that. There are people who are betrayed by, siblings. I have an example of a sibling who, when they were young adults, the brother kind of ratted out the sister who was cheating on her boyfriend, and she felt very betrayed by this brother because he had been the one person that she could trust to have her back. And she felt very betrayed by that and cut him off for many years. And they came to see me years later when their father was sick, and the son had stayed in touch, but the daughter, who had felt so betrayed, had not been in touch. The father had been abusive earlier on too. And they wanted to reconcile. They wanted to find a way of getting past that sense of betrayal. And of course, the brother felt betrayed by the sisters cutting him off too. So there was that double sense of betrayal there too. So there's lots of different ways that folks feel betrayed in many different kinds of relationships.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from you when I hear these different situations is how much it feels like the rug is being pulled from underneath of you, in that we have certain expectations or assumptions or just beliefs about how people should operate. And it gives us a sense of like stability and certainty, and how hard it is and how destabilizing it is to learn that this thing that you were relying on for a long period of time was false.
Yeah, and there's a couple of aspects to that too, because it's the fact that you were hurt, however it is you were hurt by it, is one thing, and then you have to doubt your own judgment. Because here you are, that sense of the rug being pulled out from under you. Here you are, feeling like things were stable, feeling like you knew what was what with this person, and you suddenly discover, oh, why didn't I see that coming? I should have known better than to trust this person who I've implicitly trusted. And so there's all of that sense of doubting your own judgment, doubting your own sanity sometimes, that is a big part of betrayal as well.
I'm also curious along the lines of, do you find that there's like big betrayals and small betrayals? And how often is there a sort of mutual understanding of the betrayal versus one partner doesn't think that they necessarily did anything wrong, but the other one does indeed feel betrayed?
Yeah, those are hard. Those are hard. The small betrayal is almost an oxymoron by the way I describe betrayal. Do you know what I mean? But the person feeling betrayed doesn't feel it's small, or they wouldn't call it betrayal. They'd say, well, that was a dumb thing you did, but whatever. Okay, we all do dumb things. That's not betrayal. Now, betrayal, it feels big to the person who was betrayed, or it wouldn't be betrayal. But absolutely, that phenomenon comes up a lot in the domain of sexual betrayals, precisely because through the wonders of the internet, there are so many different ways of cheating on your partner or your partner feeling cheated on than there used to be. So it's kind of amazing. Somebody will do something and the partner will think it's cheating, but they won't think it's cheating. And so the partner's feeling betrayed and the other person's saying, what's the matter with what I did? Porn is an example of that. And then, where's the line on that? Well, is looking at porn one thing, but what if you're interacting with somebody over the internet, one of those paid services where you interact with somebody? Is that cheating? And, the couples have all sorts of different understandings of that. And of course, they often don't realize they had different understandings until it comes up. Until somebody finds out, hey, you were doing that, that's not okay. Well, I didn't know it wasn't okay. And then they have to figure that out.
That leads me to wonder, before we get into coping with the betrayal, is there a way to betrayal-proof my relationship? Or are those little, just misunderstandings, unknowns, uncertainties? Oh, I didn't think that, this was cheating, but it's now that I know that you do. Is it something that is inevitable?
Yeah, I do write about that, actually, that very question. I don't think I put it in exactly those terms, but yeah, can you betrayal-proof your relationship? Short answer, no. Any questions? No, because that's for the very reason you just described. It's like, no, there's going to be stuff you hadn't thought of. So no matter how many rules you come up with, and of course, this is also true in terms of recovering from betrayal and trying to restore some sense of trust, you can't come up with a perfect set of rules that will make everybody feel just fine, because life is sometimes unpredictable. Things occur that you hadn't considered, or your reactions will be different from what you thought they would be. And so, no, I think part of the wisdom you get from going through betrayal, and I realize, saying that to somebody who's just suffering horribly borders on cruel. I don't want to say, oh, good, you're having a growth experience. I heard an acronym. I forgot who it was taught me this. I think it was somebody from the 12-step world, I believe. But the acronym is AFGO, and it stands for another fucking growth opportunity. I hope it's okay to say that word on your podcast.
Yes.
So that, it's like, oh, great, that's just all I need, AFGO, But part of the wisdom you do get from betrayal is that recognition. It's like, okay, if I thought I could trust I'd never be betrayed, that's an illusion. Now I'm thinking in Buddhist terms. It's like, yeah, attachment to anything, everything is impermanent. Trust is impermanent. Life is impermanent. Of course it's impermanent. So don't cling on to that illusion that is the source of suffering. That's not going to work well. But what you can learn from going through betrayal and surviving it is, okay, I know I can't possibly prevent any possible betrayal, but I'm pretty sure I can handle it if it happens again. I don't want it to, but I have a sense of resilience, which means then I'm better equipped to handle it if something comes up that's in that gray area. I'm less likely to panic about it and maybe can actually talk to my partner about it. And so there are some gifts you get from going through this if you manage to get through it. And and a couple that survives it, still being a couple, is often stronger for it.
That's a very hopeful message. I love that there is wisdom that can be gained from it and that a relationship can be stronger. Also not inevitable.
Not at all inevitable. No, yeah.
Got to do the work. So let's say I've just uncovered a betrayal in my relationship and I'm feeling all those things that you mentioned. I feel questioning myself. How could I have not seen this happening? I'm questioning the person that I'm with. What's the first step? How do I take care of myself?
Yeah, well, you just said it. Take care of yourself. Whatever the ways there are of taking care of yourself. So, people just seem to vary in how well equipped they are to handle that, maybe in part based on what they've gone through before. So people have gone through a lot of really hard stuff. Maybe have some of that wisdom I was just referring to. But yeah, you really have to take care of your own, do the best you can to get through the shock period and try to be your best self rather than your worst self, which is not always easy to do either. To the extent that people will often feel, among the other feelings, a lot of anger, how you handle that anger will be important, to your own recovery, never mind recovering the couple itself. So, I don't feel like I have a wonderful formula there other than get through it. And, when I do meet people at that stage, and occasionally do, in 30 years of practice, I can only think of only one time's coming to mind in 30 years where somebody dropped the bomb in the session. Do you know what I mean? Somebody said, because I usually ask in a first session, if they haven't already told me, has there been any infidelity? It's sort of one of the questions I ask pretty early on. And I've only had one time in 30 years where somebody said, well, as a matter of fact, and the partner's looking and saying, oh, really? And the shock happens right there.
Okay.
Usually there's been at least a few days or maybe a few weeks before they show up in my office. But what can you do with that? The best you can. Take care of yourself, try and find ways of little islands of calm if you can. Keep yourself busy doing things that aren't harmful. It's hard. It's not unlike what you do with early grief. You grieve, you feel terrible, you cry, you do whatever. It demands what it demands and you have to give it what it demands, but you try and keep it in some kind of bounds. And the longer you've had to process it over time, it gets less difficult.
So no one's tried to use you as damage control. Oh, now that the couples therapist here, I can drop this bomb because...
Well, just that one time. That's the only time it's ever... And, wow, that was interesting. I can think of one other occasion where somebody asked me in setting up the appointment, should they tell the person at the appointment or should they tell them before? And I said, generally, it works better if you've told them before. You can tell them at the appointment if you want, but it works better because then you'll get more out of the session. It won't just be somebody sitting there in shock and not really being able to process anything.
So I've taken care of myself. I've gotten a little bit over the shock, the anger. And I feel like there's two things that can be done here. One, we have the person who did the betrayal, perhaps take some responsibility, but also maybe the person who feels betrayed gain an understanding of perhaps why that person behaved the way that they did. But then there's the holding space part of just being there for the anger and shock and hurt. So what's the next steps towards working through this?
Well, that's where I get into the concept of forgiveness, because what I mean by forgiveness, and if you think about how do people use the word forgive, I'm sure I'm oversimplifying probably, but there's two basic ways of using it, and I use one and not the other, and I even have a reason why. So what are these two different ways of using the word forgive? Very commonly, if somebody says, okay, he cheated on me, I decided to forgive him. What that means when they're saying it is, that means I'm going to restore the relationship. They deserve forgiveness. They've expressed their sorrow, so I'm going to forgive them and give them another chance. that sense of forgiveness. Or I'm going to forgive that person, the person who screwed up royally on the job and, lost the big account, and I'm going to forgive them and let them stay on the job. That sense of forgiveness. It has to do with the relationship. In other words, I'm going to restore the relationship or continue the relationship. That's one way of using the word forgiveness. There's another way, and it's the way I prefer, which is forgiveness has almost nothing to do with the person you're forgiving. It's an inside job. And that's an expression I didn't make up either. I think that's another 12-step one. I don't know, not sure. But forgiveness is an inside job, which is to say you can forgive someone who doesn't deserve it in any sense at all. In other words, has expressed no remorse, no sense of responsibility. You can forgive somebody whom you don't trust in the slightest. You can forgive somebody that you are sure you're going to divorce or get a restraining order on, or any of the above. What does it mean to forgive somebody in that? It just means processing the trauma. In other words, you can get it so that you can think about what they did without going into panic. You cannot be preoccupied with the anger, the hurt, all of the various things that are the normal things that happen when you first hear about it. That's what I mean by forgiveness. You can let go of the anger. I and many other authors on the subject love to quote Anne Lamott about anger. She's a novelist, and she wrote that to not forgive someone is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. That what forgiveness does is it gets the poison out of you. And as I point out, this isn't her language, but I point out, then you can deal with the rat. Don't keep drinking rat poison. Get over the rat poison. Then you can figure, well, I've still got a rat to deal with. Now what do I do? Maybe this rat is not such a rat. Maybe I can deal with this person. Whole different set of questions. And the reason I prefer that way of understanding forgiveness is that it's empowering rather than disempowering. Because if forgiveness, in that sense of feeling free of the shock reaction, if that doesn't depend on anyone else, then I have the power to make it happen, or at least to facilitate it. And on the contrary, if it depends on someone else deserving it or doing the right kind of apology or something like that, or if it depends on my trusting them, then I'm stuck. I'm caught in whatever it is that I'm hurt by.
Yeah, I really think that's a very important distinction. I think we have the image of a person on two knees saying, please forgive me. And the other person going, okay. And that means the first definition, as you mentioned, I will restore this relationship. But it is really beautiful to think of forgiveness as something that happens inside, as an internal shift, as a letting go of the anger and resentment.
Yeah, and that's when, if you can do that, and look, none of this is like a light switch, none of this is like all or nothing. But if you've largely been through that process, and I do talk about a 3-step process to forgiveness, but when you're through that forgiveness enough, that's when you can consider, okay, well, what do I want to do about this relationship? Is there a way we can restore trust, which is not at all an inside job? That's a two-way street. That requires both parties to, it's interesting when there's been a betrayal. If somebody betrayed me, I have to decide, okay, if I've managed to get through the forgiveness, I have to decide, okay, can I trust them again? Do I want to restore the relationship to what it was? But if I've betrayed someone else, I have to think about that about them too. In other words, the one who did the betrayal was also hurt by this. I know it, in terms of, I'm not absolving anybody of moral culpability, but typically, if somebody has hurt someone badly, the other person has been really angry, has probably, at the very least, emotionally abandoned them for some period of time, has probably said some pretty awful things to them. They've hurt them too. And building a relationship forward, it's not going to work well if one of them is is forever the convicted wrongdoer, and the other one is the one who constantly needs reassurance. That's not going to work out for most folks. Don't want to be in a relationship like that. So the question of, can you restore trust? That requires both parties to be active participants. That's where things like apologies can come in. It can be useful. It's not a sure thing, of course, but an actual effective apology from someone can help in the process of restoring trust.
So you just dropped 3-step process to forgiveness.
I did.
So I think I got to hear it.
Maybe I should talk about that. Yes. I came up with this many years ago. And so again, with the caveat that anytime anybody says, oh, there's 3 steps, it's not like black and white simple, but I do put them in order for a reason. So step 1 is to forgive yourself. And what do I mean by forgiving yourself? Well, first of all, why do I need to forgive myself? because just about inevitably, if I've been hurt by someone or something, I'm partly blaming myself. I've seen this in adults who were sexually abused as young children. And as adults, they're still blaming themselves. At 3, there's somebody molesting them and they're saying, I should have stopped it. They rationally, I'm sure they know better. I mean, my God, a 3-year-old doesn't have the power to do that. But in terms of emotionally, there's reasons why we blame ourselves. It gives us some sense of, that the world isn't completely horrible. That, okay, maybe this happened because I didn't prevent it, and that means maybe I can prevent it in the future. It isn't realistic, but it's often a survival skill to just partly blame yourself. So you have to get past that. And the way you can forgive yourself is by recognizing, wow, knowing what I knew and not knowing what I didn't know, I was doing the best I could. It's that sense. It's like, I wish I had known. I would have done things differently, but I didn't know. And, I wish I'd known, but I didn't. So given who I was, given what I knew, I guess I was doing the best I could. That's what forgiveness feels like. It's like, oh, damn, I can regret it, but I don't have to blame myself anymore. So that's step 1, forgiving yourself. And I claim that step 2 is a pretty short step. Step 2 is forgiving whoever hurt you. And the reason I claim that's a short step is if you really have gotten that notion of forgiving yourself, if you really have internalized that idea that says, damn, I was doing the best I could. Well, damn it, so were they. I wish they hadn't, I wish they hadn't thought of things the way they did. I wish they hadn't been drunk. I wish they hadn't been, not known the things they didn't know or not had the attitudes they had, but they did. And again, doesn't absolve them of moral responsibility, but it's like, well, there's no point being angry about it. Now I have to figure out what to do about it. But I can let go of the panic part. I let go of the resistance to the reality of what happened. And as I say, if you've really forgiven yourself deeply enough, then it's a pretty short step to say, well, shit, they were doing the same thing they could too. They were doing the best they could, like I was. Wish we had all done better there, but there it was. So that's step 2. But there leaves one more step, which I think is really key. And I gave it the funny title, Forgive God. Now, why do I mean forgive God? First of all, I claim that is a useful way of saying it, even to people who say, oh, this whole God business is nonsense. That's cool too. You don't have to be a sort of Western religious sort of theist type person to forgive God. What I mean is forgive the sense that we live in a universe where we have this tantalizing sense that we're in control of stuff. And it turns out that there are circumstances we couldn't prevent. So it's really forgive God turns out, as I point out in the book, turns out to be essentially synonymous with what I call a mindset of faith. And a mindset of faith is one in which you say, you know what, reality is right to be what it is. I can't possibly understand all the ins and outs. I'm in the middle of it. I don't have all the data all at once, whatever, again, the sort of a God's eye view of the universe would be. I'm not the whole universe. I'm just my little bit of it with my little limited understanding. So I can't understand how everything fits together, but there's some rightness to this whole business. The universe is right to be what it is. I better work with it instead of insisting that it not be what it is. When you're there, that's the antidote to panic. That's like, okay, I don't like this, but I better work with it. And so those are the 3 steps. And so, when you can get to that point where you can look at it and say, wish it hadn't happened, but okay, here we are. Now what? When you're there, that's when you can figure out how do you move on.
I love that. Forgive yourself. You did the best you could. Forgive whoever hurt you. They did the best they could. And then put some trust and faith in the universe. Forgive God too.
Yeah. And I do point out, the reason I like that language, forgive God, even folks who would be sort of, committed atheists, the God we need to forgive is, and I made a point of using gendered language here, so many people are, especially in Judaism and Christianity, especially you'll see this, are trying to make, to degenderize, or not insist that God is he, because, God is God, not a person. But my thesis is, no, the God you need to forgive is he. You don't need to forgive Mother God. You need to forgive Father God. Again, I'm being stereotypical here. You need to forgive the one who's making the rules and enforcing them, and you may not like it, as opposed to the nurturing Earth Mother. That's not the God we need to forgive. That's the God we want help from. But the God we need to forgive is the one who's just been really mean to us by letting this happen. I like that sense of being able to relate to the universe as a person because we are people and that's how we emotionally relate. That's how religions get their metaphors.
I love that. So I think along with defining betrayal and forgiveness, we got to talk about trust and what trust is, because you might have heard the metaphor that trust is like a wall or a house that you build brick by brick. And I feel like a lot of people, when they do experience betrayal, feel like the whole wall has now fallen down. Like it's all the work, the 5 years, 10 years that we've been together is now reduced to rubble.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear your opinion on this metaphor, but also what does it mean to rebuild better and stronger than before?
Yeah. I like that metaphor. What occurred to me as you said it was, what's the name of that game? Jenga? Is that the one?
Yes.
Where you're putting together things and you have to pull it out a little bit by little bit and then the whole, and hope the whole thing doesn't topple down. And I think after a betrayal, what you thought was that solid brick wall, now you're thinking, oh my God, it was a Jenga construction and somebody just pulled out the one thing that the whole thing was depending on and it collapsed. So yeah, that issue, that concept of when there's been a betrayal, it feels like now you can't trust anything. That does come up. Where I see that is where somebody discovers that their partner had lied to them about something. And they will often feel like, oh my God, if you've lied to me about that, I can't trust anything you ever say. And I mean, I understand where that comes from. You think you can just trust somebody that they would always be truthful with you. It turns out not to be the case much of the time. And a lot of the time people are relaxed about it until something horrible happens. You know what I mean? Little lies. And, maybe I'm being too broad about the definition of lie, but, we're not always honest with our partners about how we're feeling. We're not always honest with our partners about, gee, how do I look in this outfit? Things of that sort. Although I have a thing that, my wife and I joke about it because what I say to her, and I actually mean this, this is not, when she says, how do I look in this? And I say, well, I'm probably not the right one to ask because I think you look beautiful in anything. So, and then I might say, but I like the other one better, I can actually offer an opinion, but that part is actually true. But that phenomenon that any sort of violation of trust feels like it demolishes it completely. Part of the recovery from that, I think, is to recognize that's too exacting a standard for human beings. That, we all fail each other, even in terms of things like total honesty on occasion. And so when you're rebuilding trust, it's not on the basis that, oh my God, I have to make sure you'll never lie to me, or I have to, continually check your phone for for 6 months, after which I'll randomly check it, or, things like that. That does not build trust. It just reinforces suspicion. Trust is built based on that sense that it's really based on faith. I don't mean faith that trust doesn't mean you're going to stay with the person, but the first trust you need to get is that you can handle what happens. And then you can take whatever risks you choose to take or not take risks you don't choose to take. To stay together after there's been a betrayal always is some kind of risk because, you can't sit with someone and say, oh, we know that will never happen when it has already happened. It's like, well, you've learned from this, so we hope it won't happen again. But, anything that is possible to happen, if it's possible, you can't completely rule it out. So the trust is going to be based on a sense of this is worth the risk of staying together, and I think we can build something that will feel good and we'll handle it if something goes wrong.
Yeah, I love that. Recognizing that we aren't always 100% honest with our partners at all times.
Yeah.
And trust isn't a Jenga tower that suddenly gets demolished. I'm not sure what metaphor I might use, but it's a little bit more resilient than something that immediately gets destroyed after a singular event. So we've talked about acknowledging the betrayal, self-care through it, practicing forgiveness, and then rebuilding trust. Is there anything else in this process that we haven't talked about?
I think we've pretty well covered it. I'm thinking through, what did I write about in the book? And those are pretty much the topics. I did have a chapter, I think you might have mentioned it, or maybe I did, a chapter on what if you're the betrayer and how might you proceed? Because if you're the betrayer and you're reading a book like this, it's generally because first of all, you've acknowledged you're the betrayer. Well, you've either acknowledged you're the betrayer, or at least you're dealing with a partner who has accused you of being the betrayer. And you're trying to figure out, if you'd like to save the relationship, you're trying to figure out how to proceed. And so the steps involved in that are actually fairly similar. to the steps involved in recovering when someone else has betrayed you. You have to be able to kind of go through those 3 steps, and forgive yourself, of course, is huge if you're the one who feels bad about having betrayed someone. And you still have to forgive the person you betrayed because they've hurt you too. And in fact, a lot of betrayals, this is especially true, you hear about this with folks in, violations of monogamy, sexual violations, that there's been a history where they have been justifying stepping outside to themselves. They have felt hurt by their partner or unheard by their partner, or somehow things haven't been working and they haven't been able to address it with their partner. And that's what often, again, not always, but often sets the stage for infidelity of one kind or another. And so to be able to heal from that involves that person forgiving the other person for that having been true. And a lot of time, and that's a tricky one in the work, in the therapy work that goes on around betrayals, because at a certain point, the person who was betrayed often has to look at their own contribution to the context. And you got to be careful with that, I think, because it can sure sound, especially early on, like, oh, you're just making excuses for somebody who did something terrible. And I understand why someone would feel that way. But it isn't about making excuses. It's about understanding the context. And if someone isn't willing to examine the context, they're probably going to end up where they were. They're not actually going to learn from what they need to learn.
Yeah, there's a few very silly examples that I'm thinking from both movies and television. There's this one where a husband lied about working late when really he went to go see a movie.
Looks bad.
Because he wanted to see a movie by himself and have some peace and quiet. And a similar thing happened in this television show where this wife found out that he was getting a hotel room in every afternoon on a Tuesday, and was like, oh man, he's cheating on me. Turns out he just wanted 3 hours of quiet from the kids.
Yeah.
So, but I was, thinking about those scenarios, I'm like, yes, we don't need to blame the person who got betrayed. But in these very silly examples, the person betrayed because they didn't feel comfortable expressing the truth, expressing I want a boundary. I just need time to myself. I need to take care of myself. I want to go do this, without you, or, something like that. So betrayal often is a result of dishonesty. And what I'm hearing from you is that we can all create a culture in our relationship that promotes honesty and openness.
Yeah, the word I like to use for that, and I didn't make it up, is intimacy. That's what I mean by intimacy. It's where you can take that risk, because what intimacy involves in those very situations is risking anxiety. It's like, okay, this is scary. If I tell her I want to go to a hotel room for 3 hours in the afternoon, she's going to wonder, what's the matter with us? What's the matter with me? What's the matter with you? It's like she's not necessarily going to be happy about that, or at least I don't know it. That involves risking anxiety. So intimacy, I always talk about that, almost always in the first session with folks, that the skills of intimacy are all about tolerating anxiety. And often when couples don't do that, that's what lays the groundwork for trouble down the line. My favorite metaphor around that is a living or a plant. You plant a seed in soil, and then somebody comes along and paves over it. Well, plants need stability. That's what roots are for. They provide stability. They hold it in place. But intimacy is the energy for growth, and it's going to try to grow or die trying. And often what it'll do is crack the sidewalk. And so what a couple will often do if intimacy has been compromised is somehow or other crack the sidewalk. And then often an affair is often cracking the sidewalk. Or fighting about everything and nothing is often a sort of unconscious attempt to crack the sidewalk. It's like, this is clearly intolerable, but what are we, we're not getting at what we clearly need to get at here, because we know we're not fighting about how to load the dishwasher, really. We're fighting about something else.
I love that. You're a good metaphor. You're a good writer. And a good writer knows how to use a good metaphor. I love that. A seed that grows unchecked will crack the sidewalk. You're going to trip, fall on your face.
Yeah.
So I absolutely love your very hopeful message that this is something we can get over and trust is something that can be rebuilt. But I'm sure there are circumstances where this means the end. This means the end of the partnership or the relationship. What are the circumstances where betrayal is not something that can be worked through and trust is not something that can be rebuilt?
Yeah, it's fascinating because I don't know of a nice classification scheme that really covers that. You would think, something like violence, for example, physical dangerous violence, you would think a couple couldn't recover from. And as a couples therapist, you got to be careful with that because it can be dangerous to do work in that sort of circumstance. And yet I have met couples. I haven't worked with couples who have been violent while I've been working with them because that's a contraindication. But I've met couples where there was violence earlier in their relationship that they recovered from. So even that, that's the one you think, oh my God, you can't recover from that. Well, even that sometimes is recoverable. I will note that whether a couple stays together or not, I have long since given up trying to predict. It seems to have, again, I don't know what all the parameters are there. I will say that I don't measure healing by whether or not they stay together. I have worked with couples that my view is they have healed. They have been better off for having gone through it, and they have separated or divorced. And what does that look like in a couple? Let's say if they have kids, what it looks like is they divorce, but they don't hate each other. They divorce with a sense of clarity, and they can be good partners in raising their kids. So, and look, I do have a bias in the work. I love to help people stay together, if they both want to. But I also recognize that whether healing isn't all about just staying together. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. That, when a couple realizes, oh my God, we are two good people, but we shouldn't try to be together. That is also a form of healing as well. And they can both move forward with a sense of, wow, not only did we learn from that, but what I like to think is we learned from that, and we don't have to write off that time we spent together as a failure. It's like we had good times, we had love, we had what we had. It didn't ultimately we decided to split up, but that doesn't render the whole thing meaningless. And that to me is an element of healing as well. But, I don't, in terms of that question, can you forgive anything? I actually have a section in my book I write about that. I mentioned I'm Jewish. Can I forgive Hitler? Can I forgive the Nazis? It depends on how you define forgiveness. But the way I define forgiveness, yes, I don't have to fly into a rage when I think about what they did. I don't have to feel panic. That doesn't for a moment prevent me from absolutely resolving that I would never, I would go to war. I'm not a pacifist, I would go to war if necessary to prevent the Nazis from doing what they did. But my point is, forgiveness doesn't mean that you say it's okay what they did or that you wouldn't oppose it violently if necessary. It just means you don't have to be governed by it. And, Viktor Frankl is the name that comes to mind. And I think you quoted Viktor Frankl in your book, as I recall.
Absolutely.
And it's funny because lots of books I read by folks like you and me quote Viktor Frankl. He comes up because he's an example of that. It's like, wow, you can rise to that level of spiritual wholeness, even at Auschwitz. And that's an amazingly inspiring thing to many people, including me.
I feel like it very much ties into something you mentioned at the very beginning, that there's a difference between the individualistic love and the universal, and that we can universally love everyone, but that doesn't mean in our personal relationships we're not still putting up boundaries, still preventing certain behavior from happening. And what I'm hearing from you is like, yes, betrayal might mean the end of the relationship, but you might still be able to keep the person in your heart, even as you are distancing yourself in your physical space, whether it's, divorce and separation and different things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a very important element of healing, really. My wife and I are our second marriages. We were each through earlier marriages and have, great respect for our exes. But that phenomenon of having been through that, I learn a lot from that, by my own experience of that and working with other folks, that you can still have this sense that the time you spent loving someone was meaningful, good time in your life. It's not like you have to say, oh my God, that was a wasted X number of years. It's like, no, that wasn't a wasted X number of years. It's part of who you are, and that's good. Well, that's a statement of faith. It's like, yeah, all this crap we go through, we can't know all the reasons. I don't like that simplistic, well, everything happens for a reason. Okay, everything may happen for a reason, but I know damn well that I can't possibly have all the reasons. I don't have all the facts. There's no way to get them all. But I can still accept the rightness of it. And that applies to how you think of someone that you had a relationship with that you've broken up with. It's like, well, yeah, that was what it was. And that had its good points. It was good for that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bruce Chalmer, for coming back onto the show. This has been a really lovely conversation and so important, especially because it is inevitable, as you say, experiencing tiny little betrayals from time to time. I do have to finish by asking the question I ask all of my guests, which is, what do you wish everyone knew about love?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to remember how I answered it last time, and I'm apt to say the same thing. I have my little 7-word formula, which is the basis of the podcast my wife and I do, couples therapy in 7 words. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. That's what I wish everyone knew about love, and the ramifications of that. Especially the faith part is what facilitates that, and we would be living in a more loving world, which is a nice thing to aspire to.
Yeah, it seems very appropriate to our current conversation. Like, be kind to yourself in this betrayal and don't panic, as easy as it is to think this is the end of the world. Mm-hmm. Dr. Bruce Chalmer, author of Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again. For our listeners who want to learn more about you, how can they find you?
They can go to my website, which is brucechalmer.com. If they are interested in the podcast that my wife, Judy Alexander, and I do, they can go to CT in 7, that stands for Couples Therapy in 7 words, so CT in the number 7, ctin7.com. They will see all of our podcast episodes. There are links on either of those to information about my books and other information about my practice and so forth.
Wonderful. Well, your couples are lucky to have you, just as we on the podcast are lucky to have you come back and share all this wonderful wisdom. I appreciate your hopeful message and wise understanding of the dynamics of relationships. So thanks again, Bruce.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
Wow, what an incredible interview. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you remember all of the valuable lessons that Bruce shared with us today, including betrayal is when we are hurt by someone who we never thought would hurt us in that way. And unfortunately, betrayal will happen in relationships. No matter how many rules you can come up with, you can't cover all the circumstances that are going to happen in life. Fortunately, there is wisdom to be gained by going through the betrayal, and you can end up stronger than ever before. Remember the 3-step process to forgiveness. Forgive yourself. Recognize you were doing the best you could. Forgive whoever hurt you. They were doing the best they could. And forgive God, or put some trust and faith in the universe that things are going as they should. And don't forget to deal with any issues in your relationship right now. A seed that grows unchecked will create a crack in the sidewalk. And issues that go unchecked in our relationships will create cracks in them as well. And remember, you are perfect just the way you are. You are lovable, loving, and loved.
Thanks again for listening to the Learn to Love podcast. To learn more about the show and your host, head over to zachbeach.com or theheartcenter.com. You can also follow Zach on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.